Picture this. You're a senior agricultural inspector who spent 5 years investigating the mystery behind Oregon's disappearing bee population. 40% of our native pollinators gone, killed by illegal pesticides that someone in your community has been secretly using. You've rescued dozens of bee colonies from poisoned landscapes, giving them sanctuary in your own backyard hives. Then your HOA President neighbor storms over, demanding you remove your dangerous flying rats because they're disrupting her perfect lawn aesthetic. What she doesn't know, you're the woman with authority to shut down every garden center in the county, and you're about to discover she's been using banned chemicals that turned her yard into the pollinator graveyard you've been hunting for years. But let me take you back to where this ecological nightmare really started. 6 months ago, when I moved into Willow Creek Estates and thought I'd found the perfect place to continue my mission of saving Oregon's dying bee population. My name is Maria Gonzalez. I'm 42 years old, and I'm a senior agricultural inspector for the Oregon Department of Agriculture, specializing in pesticide regulation and pollinator protection. For the past 12 years, I've been on the front lines of what scientists call the pollinator apocalypse, the systematic collapse of bee, butterfly, and other pollinating insect populations that threatens our entire food system. I grew up in the Central Valley of California in a family that had been migrant farm workers for 3 generations. My grandmother picked strawberries and grapes alongside my mother, who cleaned motel rooms during the off-season to supplement their income. They taught me that every plant, every flower, every fruit that grows depends on the tiny creatures most people never notice. The bees, moths, beetles, and flies that move pollen from bloom to bloom. When I was 8 years old, my grandmother took me to the strawberry fields where she worked and showed me something that changed my life forever. "Mira, mija," she said, pointing to a wooden box sitting at the edge of the field. "Those little workers are what make the berries possible. No bees, no strawberries, no work, no food on our table." I watched thousands of honeybees flying back and forth between their hive and the white strawberry blossoms, their legs heavy with orange pollen. My grandmother explained that farmers rented these hives because wild bees alone couldn't pollinate the massive fields that fed America. Without those rented workers, the flowers would bloom and die without ever becoming fruit. That memory drove me through college, where I studied entomology and agricultural science, and through graduate school, where I specialized in pollinator ecology and pest management. I wanted to understand the intricate relationships between plants, pollinators, and the chemicals we use to grow our food. I wanted to protect the little workers my grandmother had shown me. By the time I joined the Oregon Department of Agriculture in 2012, the crisis was already well underway. Colony collapse disorder had been devastating honeybee populations for over a decade. Wild bee species were disappearing even faster, some declining by 90% in just 20 years. The cause was complex. Habitat loss, climate change, diseases, and pesticides all played a role. But increasingly, the evidence pointed to one major culprit: neonicotinoids, a class of insecticides that had become the most widely used pesticides in the world. Neonicotinoids are neurotoxins. They attack the nervous systems of insects. Originally developed to be safer than older pesticides, they turned out to be incredibly persistent in the environment and deadly to non-target species. A single seed treated with neonicotinoids can make an entire plant toxic to bees for months. Rain washes the chemicals into groundwater, contaminating wildflowers and native plants. Even at sublethal doses, neonicotinoids impair bees' memory, navigation, and ability to communicate with their colonies. My job was to monitor pesticide use across Oregon's agricultural regions, ensuring farmers and landscaping companies followed state and federal regulations designed to protect pollinators. I tested soil and plant samples, investigated bee kill incidents, and worked with growers to adopt bee-friendly pest management practices. But the hardest part of my job was the calls. Beekeepers would phone our office reporting dead colonies, sometimes dozens of hives found empty or filled with dead bees. I'd drive out to investigate, taking samples, interviewing neighbors about recent pesticide applications, trying to piece together what had gone wrong. The worst call came in spring 2019 from a commercial beekeeper named Tom Rodriguez, who managed 400 hives in the Hood River Valley. He'd lost 80% of his colonies overnight. When I arrived at his operation, the devastation was unlike anything I'd seen. Thousands of dead bees covered the ground around the hives like snow. The few surviving colonies were weak and disoriented, their populations decimated. Soil samples revealed the cause: imidacloprid, a neonicotinoid that had been banned for outdoor residential use since 2019, but was still legal for certain agricultural applications. Someone had applied the chemical in massive quantities, either through ignorance or disregard for the law. The contamination was so severe that Tom had to relocate his surviving hives 20 miles away and destroy the dead colonies as a biohazard. That incident taught me that enforcement wasn't enough. We needed rescue and rehabilitation programs for affected bee populations. I started working with local beekeeping associations to develop protocols for rescuing colonies from contaminated areas and providing them with clean environments to recover. My own beekeeping started as part of this rescue work. I'd take in colonies that had been exposed to pesticides but weren't dead yet, weakened hives that needed time and clean forage to rebuild their populations. My backyard became a sanctuary where rescued bees could recover while I monitored their health and behavior. Each hive represented a small victory against the crisis. Colony number 1 came from a cherry orchard where illegal pesticide use had killed neighboring hives. I managed to save this one by moving it immediately after the spray incident. Colony number 2 was a swarm I captured from a suburban neighborhood where the original hive had been poisoned, but the swarming bees were clean. Colony number 3 came from an urban garden where a landscaping company had used banned chemicals without knowing the property owner kept bees. By 2023, I had 8 rescue colonies in my backyard, representing over 400,000 individual bees that had survived encounters with illegal pesticides. Each hive was equipped with monitoring equipment that tracked population levels, behavior patterns, and health indicators. The data I collected helped us understand how bees recover from pesticide exposure and develop better treatment protocols. In March 2024, I moved to Willow Creek Estates, a planned community in suburban Portland that marketed itself as environmentally conscious and sustainable living. The neighborhood had large lots with mature trees, organic gardens, and HOA covenants that claimed to promote ecological harmony. It seemed like the perfect place to continue my rescue work while maintaining easy access to my office in downtown Portland. The previous homeowner had been a master gardener who'd planted the property with native Oregon wildflowers, berry bushes, and fruit trees. Exactly the kind of habitat bees needed to thrive. I installed my 8 rescue colonies in the backyard, positioning them near the wildflower meadow where they could forage on chemical-free nectar and pollen. For 3 months, everything was perfect. The bees thrived in their new environment, their populations growing stronger each week. Neighbors would stop by to watch the hives, asking questions about bee behavior and pollinator conservation. Children were fascinated by the observation windows that let them see inside the colonies without disturbing the bees. The property backed up to a greenbelt with native oak trees and seasonal wildflowers that provided additional forage. My morning routine included checking each hive for signs of health and productivity. The sight of thousands of worker bees returning home with pollen-heavy legs filled me with the same wonder I'd felt as a child in my grandmother's strawberry fields. Then I met Susan Matthews. Susan was 56 years old, had been HOA President for 4 years, and took her role as community standards enforcer very seriously. She lived 3 houses down from me in a pristine white colonial with a lawn so perfect it looked artificial. Every blade of grass was exactly the same height. Every flower bed showed geometric precision. Every tree was pruned to mathematical symmetry. Our first interaction came on a Saturday morning in June 2024. I was in my backyard checking the hives when I heard someone clearing their throat behind me. I turned to see a blonde woman in expensive athleisure wear standing at my property line, clipboard in hand, looking like she'd stepped out of a Suburban lifestyle magazine. "Are you Maria Gonzalez?" she asked, consulting her clipboard. "Yes, I am. Can I help you?" "I'm Susan Matthews, HOA President. I need to discuss your situation with the bees." The way she said situation made it clear she considered my rescue colonies a problem rather than an ecological benefit. "What about them?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "They're creating safety and aesthetic concerns for the community. Children play in this neighborhood. People have allergies, and frankly, the constant buzzing is disrupting the peaceful atmosphere we've worked to maintain. I looked around my backyard. 8 hives positioned 200 feet from any neighbor's property line, surrounded by wildflowers and berry bushes that provided natural barriers. The bees were calm and focused on their foraging, completely ignoring our conversation. Susan, these are rescue colonies that I maintain as part of my work with the Oregon Department of Agriculture. They're completely legal under state agricultural exemptions, and they pose no threat to anyone. I don't care what the state says, Susan replied, her voice taking on a sharper edge. The HOA covenants prohibit livestock and commercial operations. Those rules exist to protect property values and community safety. Bees aren't livestock, Susan. They're beneficial insects that pollinate the plants in our neighborhood gardens. And this isn't a commercial operation, it's conservation work. It's a business. You're profiting from animals kept on residential property. That violates our agreements. I felt my professional patience wearing thin. I'm not profiting from anything. This is ecological restoration work. The bees provide pollination services that benefit every garden in the neighborhood. Susan's expression hardened. Ms. Gonzalez, I've been HOA president for 4 years. I know what belongs in a residential community and what doesn't. Swarms of insects buzzing around children's play areas is unacceptable. You have 30 days to remove them. She handed me a formal violation notice printed on HOA letterhead and walked away before I could respond. That evening, I reviewed the Willow Creek Estate's covenants and found no mention of beekeeping, insects, or agricultural activities. The livestock prohibition applied to mammals, horses, cattle, goats, pigs. The commercial activity clause prohibited businesses that generated customer traffic or employee activity on residential property. Neither applied to my rescue colonies. I called Susan the next morning to clarify the situation. Mrs. Matthews, I've reviewed the HOA covenants, and I don't see any restrictions that apply to beekeeping. The livestock clause specifically mentions mammals, and the commercial activity restriction doesn't apply to conservation work. Ms. Gonzalez, you clearly don't understand how HOAs work. The board has discretionary authority to interpret covenants in ways that protect community welfare. Dangerous insects threaten that welfare. Susan, bees aren't dangerous. They're essential pollinators that... I don't want to hear a lecture about bugs. You have 29 days to comply with the violation notice. She hung up before I could explain that removing the colonies would mean relocating 400,000 recovering bees to a new environment that might not support their rehabilitation. Over the next 2 weeks, Susan escalated systematically. She organized a petition signed by 12 residents requesting removal of the dangerous insect infestation. She scheduled a special HOA board meeting to vote on emergency restrictions for commercial agricultural operations. She hired a pest control company to evaluate the bee problem and recommend safe removal procedures. The most concerning escalation was her social media campaign. Susan created a Facebook group called Willow Creek Safety First, where she posted photos of my hives with captions like 400,000 stinging insects next door to our children and agricultural business violating residential zoning. She shared articles about bee attack incidents and allergic reactions, creating fear among neighbors who'd previously been supportive. The turning point came on July 15th when Susan knocked on my door at 7 a.m., accompanied by 2 other board members and someone she introduced as her ecological consultant. Ms. Gonzalez, we're here to conduct a safety inspection of your bee operation, Susan announced. You don't have authority to inspect my property, I replied. We have the right to verify compliance with community standards, her consultant said. He was a thin man in his 30s wearing khakis and a polo shirt with EcoSafe Pest Solutions embroidered on the chest. And who are you exactly? Brad Williams, certified pest management professional. I'm here to assess the threat level posed by your insect colonies. I looked at Brad's credentials. He was licensed for termite and rodent control, with no certification in pollinator management or bee behavior. He was qualified to kill bugs, not evaluate their ecological impact. Brad, these aren't pest insects. They're beneficial pollinators under protection by state agricultural law. You're not qualified to assess pollinator colonies. Ma'am, stinging insects are stinging insects. The threat is the same regardless of species. That comment revealed everything I needed to know about Brad's understanding of bee biology. Honeybees are incredibly docile unless directly threatened. My rescue colonies were selected for calm temperament and non-aggressive behavior. They were far less likely to sting someone than the wasps and hornets that naturally occurred in the neighborhood. "You're not entering my property without a warrant," I said firmly. Susan's face flushed red. "Ms. Gonzalez, we're trying to resolve this cooperatively. If you refuse to work with us, we'll have no choice but to pursue legal remedies." "What legal remedies?" "Code enforcement, zoning violations, public nuisance citations. We have options." That threat was exactly what I'd been waiting for. Susan was about to involve the government agencies I worked with professionally, agencies that knew me, respected my expertise, and understood the importance of pollinator conservation. "Susan, if you want to involve code enforcement and zoning officials, please go ahead. I'd be happy to explain my work to them." 3 days later, I received a call from Derek Patterson, the municipal code enforcement officer for our district. "Maria, this is Derek. I got a complaint about some kind of agricultural operation at your address. I know you work for the state, so I figured I'd call rather than just showing up." Derek and I had worked together on several cases involving illegal pesticide use in urban areas. He understood both municipal codes and agricultural regulations. "Derek, it's my rescue bee colonies. My HOA president thinks they violate residential zoning." Derek laughed. "Beekeeping's been legal in Portland residential zones since 2015. As long as you're following the setback requirements and hive limits, you're fine. Want me to come out and document compliance?" "That would be great." Derek's inspection took 30 minutes. My 8 hives were well within the municipal limit of 20 colonies per residential property. They were positioned more than the required 25 feet from property lines. I had proper registration with the state apiary program. Everything was completely legal under both city and state regulations. Derek wrote a formal report, clearing me of any zoning violations, and sent copies to Susan and the HOA board. He also included educational materials about urban beekeeping and pollinator protection laws. Susan's response arrived 2 days later. A lawsuit against the Willow Creek Estates HOA board, claiming they were failing their fiduciary duty by allowing me to operate an illegal agricultural business that threatened property values and community safety. The lawsuit wasn't against me directly. Susan's attorney had probably advised that such a suit would be dismissed immediately since I was operating legally. Instead, she sued the HOA board, demanding they either force me to remove the bees or face personal liability for declining property values. Tom Henderson, the board treasurer, called me that afternoon. "Maria, I'm sorry about this. Susan is forcing the board to either violate your legal rights or face a lawsuit we can't afford. We're meeting tonight to discuss options." That evening, I attended the emergency HOA board meeting. 15 residents packed the community center, most there to support either Susan's campaign against the bees or my conservation work. Susan presented her case first. Photos of my hives, articles about bee attacks, statements from residents concerned about children's safety, a property value analysis claiming my agricultural operation was depressing home prices. She spoke for 20 minutes, painting my rescue colonies as a neighborhood menace. When she finished, I stood up to respond. "Thank you for the opportunity to address these concerns. My name is Maria Gonzalez, and I'm a senior agricultural inspector for the Oregon Department of Agriculture. For the past 5 years, I've been investigating the disappearance of 40% of Oregon's native bee population due to illegal pesticide use. I explained the pollinator crisis, the role of rescue colonies in conservation work, and the legal framework protecting beneficial insects. I showed photos of the massive bee kills I'd investigated and described how my backyard colonies represented survivors of environmental crimes. The 8 colonies in my backyard contain 400,000 individual bees that were rescued from pesticide-contaminated areas. They're not pests or livestock. They're refugees from an ecological disaster that threatens our food system. Several residents asked questions about bee behavior, safety protocols, and the benefits of local pollination. Margaret Chen, who lived 2 streets over, mentioned that her vegetable garden had produced record harvests since I'd moved in. David Park noted that his fruit trees had never been healthier. Then Susan stood up for her rebuttal. "This is all very interesting, but it doesn't change the fact that Ms. Gonzalez is operating a business from residential property. She maintains these insects for profit, regardless of what she claims about conservation." Susan, I don't sell honey or rent pollination services. This is purely conservation work. You benefit professionally from this research. It's part of your job. That makes it commercial activity. That accusation revealed Susan's fundamental misunderstanding of both my work and the law. Research conducted by government employees for public benefit doesn't constitute commercial activity under zoning regulations. But Susan wasn't finished. More importantly, we need to consider the environmental impact of concentrating 400,000 insects in a residential area. What are they eating? What chemicals are they bringing back to our neighborhood? What's the cumulative effect on our ecosystem? That question opened the door I'd been waiting for. Susan, that's an excellent point. The environmental impact of bee colonies depends entirely on what they encounter while foraging. Bees collect nectar and pollen from flowers within a 3-mile radius of their hives. If they encounter pesticides during foraging, they bring those chemicals back to the colony, contaminating honey, wax, and larvae. I paused, looking directly at Susan. As part of my conservation work, I regularly test samples from each rescue colony for pesticide residues. The results tell me exactly what chemicals are being used illegally in our neighborhood. Susan's confident expression flickered slightly. In fact, just last week I found concerning levels of imidacloprid in samples from colony number 3. Imidacloprid is a neonicotinoid that's been banned for residential use since 2019. Finding it in bee samples means someone in our immediate area is using illegal pesticides. The room went quiet. Several residents looked concerned. As Oregon's senior agricultural inspector, I have a legal obligation to investigate pesticide violations. I'll be collecting soil samples throughout the neighborhood to identify the source of contamination. Susan's face had gone pale, but she tried to maintain her authority. Ms. Gonzalez, you can't just test people's private property without permission. Actually, I can. Under Oregon Administrative Rule 603-05-7-0100, agricultural inspectors have authority to collect samples from any area where pesticide contamination is suspected. That includes residential properties. The meeting ended with the board voting 4-1 to dismiss Susan's violation notice and support my legal right to maintain rescue colonies. Only Susan voted to uphold the violation. But I knew this wasn't over. Susan's questions about environmental impact suggested she was worried about something beyond aesthetic concerns. Her defensive reaction to pesticide testing indicated she understood exactly what I'd been talking about. The next morning, I started my investigation. Pesticide contamination investigations follow a systematic pattern. First, you map the foraging area to identify potential contamination sources. Bees typically forage within a 3-mile radius, but the highest concentrations come from the immediate neighborhood within half a mile. I divided Willow Creek Estates into a grid pattern and began collecting soil samples from common areas, the park, walking trails, and retained green spaces where I had legal access. I also tested plant samples from areas with public easements and documented any visible signs of pesticide application. The initial results were concerning. Soil samples from the neighborhood park showed elevated levels of imidacloprid and clothianidin, both neonicotinoids banned for outdoor residential use. Plant samples from the walking trail contained traces of glyphosate at concentrations that could harm beneficial insects. But the most disturbing discovery came from air sampling near my bee colonies. Using specialized equipment that collected pollen and dust particles, I found multiple banned pesticides at levels that explained the health issues I'd been seeing in some of my rescue colonies. Colony number 3 had been showing symptoms of neonicotinoid exposure, disoriented foraging behavior, reduced honey production, and increased mortality rates. Colony number 7 had developed what appeared to be pesticide-induced nosema, a parasitic infection that becomes more severe when bees are stressed by chemical exposure. The contamination levels suggested the source was close, probably within a few hundred yards of my property. Someone in my immediate neighborhood was using multiple banned pesticides in quantities that were creating an environmental hazard. Following standard investigation protocols, I requested permission from neighbors to test their soil for contamination. Most residents agreed immediately, concerned about potential health risks to their families and gardens. The Chen family let me test their organic vegetable garden, which showed no pesticide residues. The Park family, who practiced natural landscaping, had clean soil samples. The Rodriguez family, who hired an organic lawn care service, showed only approved biological pest control agents. But when I knocked on Susan Matthews' door requesting permission to test her property, the response was immediate and hostile. Absolutely not. You have no right to trespass on my property or make accusations about my lawn care practices. Susan, I'm not making accusations. I'm investigating contamination that's affecting bee health. Testing your soil would help rule out your property as a source. I said no. My attorney will hear about this harassment. Susan's refusal to allow testing was suspicious, but not unusual. Many property owners reflexively refuse government inspections, even when they have nothing to hide. I'd need stronger evidence to justify a mandatory inspection warrant. That evidence came from an unexpected source. Jennifer Walsh, who lived across the street from Susan, called me the following Thursday afternoon. Maria, I need to show you something, but I don't want Susan to know I talked to you. Jennifer and I met at the neighborhood coffee shop that evening. She brought her laptop and pulled up photos she'd taken from her upstairs window over the past 6 months. I started documenting this because my kids' allergies got so much worse after Susan redid her landscaping last spring, Jennifer explained. The photos showed Susan's lawn care routine in disturbing detail. Every Wednesday morning, a landscaping crew would arrive with professional-grade spraying equipment. They'd suit up in full protective gear, respirators, chemical-resistant gloves, coveralls, to apply what appeared to be multiple different chemicals. Look at this, Jennifer said, zooming in on a photo. They're wearing hazmat suits to spray her lawn. Whatever they're using, it's serious enough that they need full protection. The photos showed the crew spraying not just Susan's lawn, but her flower beds, trees, and the property perimeter. The equipment appeared to be commercial grade, designed for large-scale agricultural application rather than residential landscaping. Do you know which company she's using? I asked. Pristine Landscape Solutions. They've been coming every week since March. I knew Pristine Landscape Solutions. They were licensed for commercial agricultural applications, but not certified for residential pesticide use. If they were applying commercial-grade chemicals to Susan's property, they were violating both their license conditions and state regulations. The next morning, I called Pristine's office and spoke with the owner, Rick Brennan. Rick, this is Maria Gonzalez from the Oregon Department of Agriculture. I need to discuss your service contract with Susan Matthews on Pine Ridge Road. Rick's voice immediately became defensive. What about it? I'm investigating pesticide contamination in that neighborhood. Can you tell me what products you're applying to Mrs. Matthews' property? I'd need to check with my lawyer before discussing client information. Rick, I'm conducting an official state investigation. You're required to provide product application records when requested by agricultural inspectors. Rick hesitated. Look, Maria, Mrs. Matthews is a demanding client. She wants results that require creative solutions. What kind of creative solutions? She wants a lawn that looks like artificial turf. Perfect green, no weeds, no insects, no variations. Achieving that level of perfection requires products and application rates that go beyond typical residential services. Are you using neonicotinoids? Another pause. Mrs. Matthews specifically requested products that would eliminate all insects from her property. She's very concerned about bees and wasps near her house. That admission confirmed my suspicions. Susan hadn't just been using banned pesticides, she'd been paying a commercial company to create a chemical dead zone designed specifically to kill pollinators. Rick, neonicotinoids have been banned for outdoor residential use since 2019. If you're applying them to residential property, you're violating state pesticide regulations. Mrs. Matthews told us she had agricultural exemptions. She said she was running some kind of plant research operation. She's not. You've been applying restricted-use pesticides without proper permits to residential property in violation of your license. Rick's voice became panicked. Maria, if we've been doing something wrong, we'll fix it immediately. Mrs. Matthews insisted she had the legal authority for these applications. I arranged to meet Rick at his office that afternoon to review the complete application records for Susan's property. What I discovered was worse than I'd imagined. Since March 2024, Pristine had been applying military-grade pesticides to Susan's property on a weekly basis, imidacloprid at concentrations designed for commercial agriculture, clothianidin at rates that exceeded even agricultural recommendations. chlorpyrifos, which had been banned for residential use due to neurodevelopmental toxicity. The application records showed that Susan had requested total insect elimination and maximum residual effectiveness. She'd paid premium rates for pesticide cocktails that would remain toxic in soil for months. Most damning, the records included email exchanges where Susan explicitly requested products that would kill every bee within 500 yards of her property. She'd described my rescue colonies as an infestation that needed to be eliminated and asked for chemicals that would make sure no bees survived near my house. Rick had documentation proving that Susan knew she was using banned pesticides and had specifically targeted my bee colonies for chemical attack. She hadn't just violated environmental regulations, she'd committed intentional ecological sabotage. That evening, I called Derek Patterson to discuss enforcement options. Derek, I need to request an emergency inspection warrant for 1847 Pine Ridge Road. I have evidence of massive pesticide violations that pose an immediate threat to human health and environmental safety. What kind of violations? Military-grade neonicotinoids applied to residential property at agricultural rates, multiple banned substances, intentional targeting of protected pollinator colonies. The contamination levels are severe enough to qualify as environmental crimes. Derek's investigation team arrived at Susan's property the next morning with soil sampling equipment, air quality monitors, and documentation cameras. Susan met them at her door with an attorney and immediately demanded to see warrants. Ma'am, we have a valid inspection warrant based on evidence of pesticide violations that threaten public health, Derek explained, showing the court order. This is harassment, Susan screamed. You're persecuting me because I complained about dangerous insects in our neighborhood. Derek's team spent 4 hours documenting the contamination. Soil samples contained pesticide residues at levels that exceeded agricultural safety standards. Groundwater testing revealed chemical runoff that was migrating to neighboring properties. Air quality measurements showed toxic vapors that could cause respiratory problems in children and elderly residents. The most shocking discovery was Susan's lawn itself. Despite months of intensive chemical treatment, it was beginning to show signs of ecological collapse. Earthworms had disappeared. Beneficial insects were gone. Even the grass was struggling, showing brown patches where chemical burns had damaged root systems. Susan had spent thousands of dollars creating a sterile wasteland that couldn't support any form of life, including the plants she'd been trying to perfect. Derek's preliminary report classified Susan's property as an environmental hazard requiring immediate remediation. The pesticide contamination was so severe that the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality would need to oversee the cleanup process. But the investigation had also revealed something I hadn't expected. While testing neighboring properties for contamination spread, Derek's team discovered that Susan's chemical applications had actually improved some of my rescue colony's health. The pesticides she'd used were so toxic that they'd killed the varroa mites and other parasites that had been stressing my bees. Colony number 3, which had been showing symptoms of neonicotinoid exposure, had actually been suffering from mite infestation, made worse by low-level chemical stress. Susan's massive pesticide applications had inadvertently eliminated the mites while providing my bees with a brief chemical detox period. It was ecological irony at its finest. Susan's attempt to poison my bees had accidentally cured some of their health problems while destroying her own property. The Oregon Department of Environmental Quality issued its enforcement action 3 weeks later. Susan faced $45,000 in fines for violating state pesticide regulations, groundwater protection laws, and endangered species protections. She was required to pay for professional soil remediation that would cost an additional $85,000. Pristine Landscape Solutions lost their license and faced criminal charges for knowingly applying banned pesticides. Rick Brennan cooperated with investigators and received a reduced sentence in exchange for providing evidence about other clients who'd requested similar illegal services. The most severe consequence was the legal discovery process. Susan's lawsuit against the HOA had opened her personal records to examination, and investigators found email exchanges proving she'd specifically targeted my rescue colonies for elimination. Under Oregon's environmental protection statutes, intentionally poisoning protected species is a felony. The Attorney General's office filed criminal charges against Susan for environmental terrorism. specifically using banned pesticides as weapons against federally protected pollinators. The day Susan's lawn care violations hit the news, I received calls from beekeepers across the Pacific Northwest reporting similar suspicious bee kills near suburban properties with suspiciously perfect landscaping. Our investigation had uncovered what appeared to be a regional network of landscaping companies providing illegal pesticide services to wealthy homeowners obsessed with perfect lawns. The environmental damage from Susan's chemical war extended far beyond her property. Soil testing revealed that pesticide runoff had contaminated the seasonal creek that ran through our neighborhood's greenbelt. Water samples from the community pond showed chemical levels that were toxic to amphibians and aquatic insects. Most tragically, retrospective analysis of bee mortality data suggested that Susan's weekly pesticide applications had been killing wild bees throughout our neighborhood for months. Native bee species that had taken decades to establish in the area had been systematically eliminated by chemical drift from her property. The ecological recovery would take years. The Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife estimated that restoring native pollinator populations in our area would require extensive habitat rehabilitation and careful monitoring to ensure chemical residues had degraded to safe levels. But there was hope in the response from our community. The other residents of Willow Creek Estates had been horrified to learn about the contamination and eager to help with restoration efforts. Margaret Chen organized a native plant sale to replace the exotic ornamentals that had dominated many yards. David Park started a neighborhood composting program to build healthy soil biology. Jennifer Walsh, who'd provided the crucial documentation that exposed Susan's crimes, became an advocate for pesticide-free landscaping. She connected neighbors with organic lawn care services and shared information about natural pest management techniques. The HOA board, freed from Susan's litigation threat, revised the community covenants to explicitly protect the pollinator habitat and prohibit the use of banned pesticides. They established a neighborhood conservation fund to support native plant restoration and educational programs about ecological gardening. Susan's property became a cautionary tale. After spending $130,000 on fines, remediation, and legal fees, she was forced to sell her house at a substantial loss. The new owners, a young couple named Rachel and Marcus Kim, were environmental science graduate students who wanted to restore the property as a model of sustainable landscaping. I worked with Rachel and Marcus to design a remediation plan that would gradually heal the soil and reestablish beneficial insect habitat. We planted native wildflowers that would provide clean forage for my rescue colonies while attracting native bee species back to the area. 6 months after Susan's conviction, my 8 rescue colonies had not only recovered from the chemical stress, but had grown strong enough to split into 14 healthy colonies. The additional hives provided insurance against future losses while expanding our local pollinator population. More importantly, the success of our neighborhood rehabilitation project had attracted attention from conservation organizations across Oregon. The Oregon Bee Project featured our work in their annual report. The Xerces Society invited me to speak at their national conference about community-based pollinator protection. The University of Oregon's Department of Environmental Studies established a research partnership with our neighborhood to study urban pollinator recovery in formerly contaminated areas. Graduate students monitor bee health, plant diversity, and chemical residue levels to document the ecological healing process. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Tom Rodriguez, the commercial beekeeper who'd lost 80% of his colonies to pesticide poisoning in 2019, visited our neighborhood to see the recovery in action. "Maria, this is what hope looks like," Tom said, watching my rescue colonies foraging on native Oregon wildflowers. 5 years ago, I thought commercial pesticide use would eventually kill every bee in Oregon. Seeing communities like this fight back gives me faith that we can turn this crisis around. Tom's visit coincided with the first anniversary of Susan's conviction. Our neighborhood had organized a Pollinator Protection Day to celebrate the ecological recovery and educate other communities about bee-friendly practices. Rachel and Marcus Kim had transformed Susan's former chemical wasteland into a showcase of sustainable landscaping. Native Oregon grape and wildflower meadows attracted diverse bee species. Rain gardens captured runoff that had once carried toxic chemicals into the creek. Composting systems had rebuilt soil biology that could support healthy plant communities. My rescue bee colonies had become the centerpiece of the neighborhood's transformation. Visitors could observe the hives through glass panels while learning about pollinator biology, pesticide impacts, and conservation techniques. The monitoring data I collected showed steady improvements in bee health as chemical residues degraded and plant diversity increased. The success of our rehabilitation project led to expansion opportunities I'd never imagined. The Oregon Department of Agriculture offered me a promotion to State Pollinator Protection Coordinator, overseeing conservation programs across the Pacific Northwest. The position would involve training other agricultural inspectors in pesticide enforcement and developing protocols for community-based habitat restoration. But the most important outcome was personal. My grandmother's lesson about the little workers who make food possible had evolved into a career protecting those workers from the chemicals that threaten their survival. The 8 rescue colonies in my backyard represented more than 600,000 individual bees that had survived environmental crimes and now thrived in a community that understood their value. Susan Matthews had tried to eliminate what she saw as dangerous pests, disrupting her perfect suburban aesthetic. Instead, her chemical war had exposed a criminal network of illegal pesticide use while galvanizing community support for ecological restoration. The Oregon Attorney General's office used our case as a model for prosecuting environmental crimes targeting protected species. Susan's conviction established legal precedent that intentionally poisoning pollinators qualified as ecological terrorism under state environmental protection statutes. More broadly, our neighborhood's transformation demonstrated that suburban communities could become havens for biodiversity when residents understood the connections between healthy ecosystems and human welfare. The native plants that supported my rescue bees also provided habitat for birds, butterflies, and beneficial insects that controlled garden pests naturally. Children in the neighborhood grew up understanding that the scary insects Susan had tried to eliminate were actually the workers that made their families' gardens productive. They learned to identify different bee species, understand pollination biology, and recognize the signs of pesticide damage in the environment. 3 years later, Willow Creek Estates has become a regional model for pollinator-friendly communities. Our HOA covenants protecting beneficial insects have been adopted by 12 other developments in the Portland metro area. The restoration techniques we developed are taught in university environmental science programs. The teenage children who watch my rescue colonies recover from pesticide poisoning have become advocates for pollinator protection in their own right. Several have pursued studies in entomology and conservation biology, inspired by seeing ecological recovery happen in their own neighborhood. The 8 rescue colonies that survived Susan's chemical attacks have now produced 43 healthy daughter colonies distributed across urban apiaries throughout Oregon. Each new hive represents thousands of pollinators working to rebuild the ecosystem services that commercial agriculture and suburban development had disrupted. Tom Rodriguez expanded his commercial operation to include urban pollinator conservation, working with cities to establish the bee-friendly policies and habitat restoration programs. His success inspired other beekeepers to diversify from honey production into ecological consulting and community education. The research partnerships established through our Neighborhood Recovery Project have documented the return of native bee species that hadn't been seen in the area for decades. Species diversity indices show ecological complexity approaching levels that existed before intensive development, and chemical landscaping transformed the region. Every spring, when I check my colonies for signs of winter survival and population growth, I remember my grandmother pointing to that wooden box in the strawberry field. "Those little workers make the berries possible," she'd said. "No bees, no strawberries." Today, those little workers are making much more than strawberries possible. They're making suburban communities into functioning ecosystems. They're teaching children to value biodiversity over artificial perfection. They're proving that environmental protection and human welfare aren't competing interests. They're inseparable parts of a healthy future. Susan Matthews learned too late that trying to eliminate nature from her environment ultimately eliminated the beauty and productivity she'd been seeking. Her chemical war against my rescue bees destroyed her own property while demonstrating the futility of fighting ecological relationships that had evolved over millions of years. The $130,000 she spent on fines, remediation, and legal fees could have created the most spectacular pollinator garden in Oregon. Instead, her obsession with chemical perfection left her bankrupt and homeless, while the bees she'd tried to kill thrived in the healthy community that replaced her sterile wasteland. If you're dealing with neighbors who think pesticides are the answer to every garden challenge, share this story. If you're considering bee-friendly landscaping but worried about HOA restrictions, remember that federal and state laws protect beneficial insects regardless of local rules. Most importantly, if you see signs of illegal pesticide use in your community, dead bees around treated areas, chemical odors from neighboring properties, or landscaping crews wearing hazmat suits for routine applications, report it to your state agricultural department. Environmental crimes often go undetected until someone with expertise recognizes the warning signs. My rescue bees saved our neighborhood by revealing the hidden contamination that was poisoning our shared environment. Sometimes the creatures we're tempted to eliminate are actually the early warning system protecting us from much more serious threats. The 43 colonies now thriving across Oregon carry genetic memories of surviving pesticide exposure, making them more resilient to future chemical attacks. They represent evolution in action, adaptation to human-created environmental pressures that strengthens entire pollinator populations. Every bee that returns to my hives with pollen-heavy legs carries proof that ecological recovery is possible when communities commit to protecting the little workers that make everything else possible. Susan's chemical war failed because she underestimated the resilience of both bees and the human neighbors who learned to value them. Thanks for listening to our story. Subscribe for more tales of HOA Karens who discovered that fighting nature is a battle they're guaranteed to lose. Because in the end, the bees always win. They've been perfecting their survival strategies for 100 million years, while perfect lawns have only existed for about 50. Remember, every garden is an ecosystem. Every bee is a worker making that ecosystem function. And every choice about pesticides is a vote for the kind of world we want to live in. Choose wisely, because the little workers are watching.